Augustine, welcome to San Antonio. We're delighted to have you back, right? You've been here.
Yes, this is my second time in San Antonio, and I'm very happy to return to play with the symphony again.
How is it that you and Sebastian have lined up with one another? How did you meet Sebastian? I guess because you're both Germans. Did you know each other in Germany or in Italy, or?
No, we just met here in San Antonio.
Oh, you didn't know
last
him in
time
Europe.
that I came. We just met before the first rehearsal. That would have been in early 2016, I think, that I did this Beethoven concerto here. And now something very different. Tchaikovsky is one of the great violin concerto war horses, masterworks.
And
yes.
I'm going to ask you about that. I've listened to a lot of your performances on YouTube, and for those in the audience who are watching this, I want you to know not only is Augustine's YouTube channel full of performances, but his own website has got lots of performances as well to really enjoy him more. But it doesn't take you long looking at you playing that you've got passion for the orchestra, for the music that you play. I think you say at some point you're trying to find that one key into the music so that you can tune in, and then out it comes on that 1720 Stradivarius?
1723, yes.
23. What an instrument.
It's a great violin. I've had it for about 7 years. And it's very beautiful. It's from this period in Antonio Stradivari's life that is referred to as the Golden Period, where he made his most famous instruments, which went somewhere between 1700 and 1725. And he would already have been actually over 80 when he made this violin, because he was still making violins when he was 90 years old.
So is it the glue, is it the varnish, is it the wood, or is it all of the above? You know, everyone has always wondered, why Stradivarius? Why the Guarnaris? Why these craftsmen? What did they find that we don't know about today?
Well, it's a long story, and there are many theories, and then there's also, I think, a certain degree of mysticism that just doesn't really help getting to the bottom of it either. In my opinion, or from what I understand of it, the wood at the time was rather special, which had to do with the climatic conditions in the centuries leading up to it. These were very old trees, so you don't really find...
And there was that ice age, apparently.
Yeah, in the 1600s.
1600s.
In the 1600s, it was very cold, so the trees grew very slowly, and these were very old trees, and so the wood was perhaps ideal. And then there was a boom of violin making. Everyone was making violins suddenly. All these craftsmen were making violins because every little duke and count all over Europe wanted to have their own court orchestra. So they were all buying violins. So it was suddenly a market for it. Everyone started making violins. And among all these makers, Stradivari, he had one of the best teachers. He studied with Nicolai Amati from a very famous violin-making family. And he was considered one of the greatest craftsmen. So just his understanding of the violin, the way that he perfected the shapes and of the models that he used, and the craftsmanship in every little detail is maybe greater than that of many of his contemporaries. And when compared with other violins from his period, there's another phenomenon, which is that the violins are very bright in sound, and therefore in a very big space, the sound carries very well. Even though the violin isn't actually louder, the many violins you'll find that are a lot louder when you hear them up close. But in a big space, because of how bright the sound is, you can still make it out quite clearly in the very back of the hall, when another violin would no longer sound clear. And
I tried that very thing out. I came to the back and listened to you, and it's very bright in the back of the hall. And then we were up in audience right, in the box to hear you play the second movement, and it's brilliant there. Brilliant.
It just has a clarity and a brightness. The sound.
Yes.
It was very the highest overtones are very strong. I don't know. You can.
And it carries over the orchestra so lovely.
Technical, yeah.
Even if Sebastian went to mezzo forte, or it doesn't. It's not needed. You're there. We can hear Augustine over it all.
Because I think perhaps the sound color is brighter than that of the instruments in the orchestra. And so, interestingly enough, at the time that Stradivari was building these instruments, people were not performing in big halls. People would have been performing in rooms that would seat maybe 100 people. And as a result, the Strads were only considered to be so great maybe at some point in the 19th century that a lot of soloists started playing them because they were playing in bigger and bigger spaces, and suddenly you had problems of projection. How can you be heard in a big hall? And so it's maybe it's almost a fluke that this quality of these instruments became so important later. He couldn't really have known. He wasn't making violins with big spaces in mind.
I never made that connection between the increased size of hall and the need for a violin that could project.
So then that's when these great makers, Guarneri del Gesù and Stradivari, are loved partly also because of how well they project in a big hall. Anyway, but I think what's very exciting is that in the last few decades, a lot of great new makers have appeared and are making really amazing violins. Because I think something happens in at some point after all these great Italian makers, there was a point when there were so many instruments around that one didn't really need more. So this whole tradition kind of died down. It's kind of stopped a little bit. There were so many thousands of instruments all over the place, enough, basically. And so a lot of the secrets were lost. And by the time that the demand had caught up, you didn't really have people who could make instruments that are this good. But I think now you probably there are people who are making just top-notch instruments. And,
yeah, and I don't want to dwell so much on that, but I agree with you in that the new instruments that are being made. We heard a soloist here last year or the year before who brought a cello that was relatively new from Chicago maker. It was a fabulous instrument. And you go, well, why not? Why not?
Okay.
In hearing you talk and reading about your background, I noticed how you locked onto, of course, Sibelius and Bartók as great loves of yours. But to me, if you can play the Franck Sonata, then with passion, all these others fall in line. And that seems to be a love of yours too, the Franck A major.
It's a great piece. So the best thing about being a violinist, perhaps, is that you don't run out of great music to play. And whatever I'm playing at the moment, I often have the thought goes through my head, what a great piece of music. Maybe this is the best one. So I actually just felt this when I was playing the Tchaikovsky. But every time, the ones you mentioned, Sibelius, Bartók second, those are among my favorite pieces. There's a lot of great music out there.
And Sibelius, the darkness of Sibelius. I mean, it's just the tonal value of what you get from your violin in playing that. It's just haunting, and it's great sound. I also noticed that did you write your own cadenza to the Brahms Violin Concerto, or is that just?
I did recently.
It sounded like the themes, and then you threw them up in the air, and they came down a little bit differently than what Brahms had written. Have you written other cadenzas as well?
I've written cadenzas to Mozart concertos and Haydn.
All five, or just the three, 4, 5?
At some point, I know I've done them for all five, but the ones that are, more recent, are maybe the better ones. So I think 4 and 5 are my better cadenzas for those. The first Paganini concerto also I made a cadenza for, The Brahms was something I had wanted to do for a long time, because Brahms did not write his own cadenza. He left it to Joachim. I think also because he felt that he wasn't the right person to write the cadenza. He had this feeling that he didn't know the violin well enough, and in fact, he sought Joachim's advice so extensively in the whole concerto, and so he just left it to Joachim. And Joachim wrote a very good cadenza, but it gets played all the time, and after many years of playing it, I felt a little bit a need for a change, for something different.
I found yours refreshing.
So yeah, it was very interesting to play it, and really inspiring to write something working with Brahms's material. And I feel like maybe I look at the whole movement at Brahms's music a little bit differently now after I worked on the cadenza, because I had to think about all these themes and motives in a different way than what I might when I'm just playing the music. So it was
when Josh Bell was here to play the Brahms, he brought his Huberman Strad that Huberman had played reportedly for Brahms earlier in the just at the end of the last century of the 19th century, 19th century.
Yeah,
and it was, and he latched onto that instrument almost by chance, and it's a brilliant instrument. Well, the question I have about your repertoire is that violinists are always called upon to do the war horses, the Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, and so on and so forth. But what are your favorites? What would you like to hear? I mean, I mentioned to Sarah Chang when she was here that one that I'd like to hear is Goldmark, but we don't hear Goldmark. What are your favorites? What would you like to, if you had a chance to tell a music director, listen, come on, we've heard all this before. Let's excite the audience with something that they haven't heard, in a concert hall at least.
Yes. Well, I think there's a lot to be said for variety. So perhaps now that I've been here with Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, if we were to talk about the next work, I would probably suggest something that was from the 20th century. It was something maybe less familiar, or in a very contrasting style.
Because
I always
Barber
think
here, of course.
that's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, and Barber is very popular and has done here.
Yes.
But an unknown to me, at Goldmark, for instance, has written this lovely violin concerto that just isn't performed in the major repertoire.
So one work that was really obscure for many years and has now actually really made it into the mainstream repertoire, like in a very short period of time, is the Britten Concerto, which it's in 60 years or so. It was initially just played very, very seldomly. It was a very obscure piece, and now in the last 10 or 20 years has had so many performances. And I learned it recently, and I think it's actually as good as anything else written in the 20th century. It's just one of the greatest pieces for violin.
Speaking of British composers, then, Thomas Adès, or is it Adès? How do you say?
Adès, yeah.
Is it Adès? He's written a violin concerto that you're performing.
Yes, I love that piece,
How
and
is
I
it
think
that
it's one of the greatest.
Got together.
Well, I'm not the first one to play this piece. So there was already recording out of it, of the piece, and I was listening to it because I was interested just in, listening. What are these new violin concertos? There've actually been a lot of violin concertos written in the last 20 years or so, or 25 years. I think it was really Ligeti who kicked off almost like a wave of violin concertos, because he wrote a violin concerto, which is a great piece.
This is the one you got the Grammy for?
No, that would be Dutilleux. That's a little bit earlier.
I thought you said Digitoo.
No, Dutilleux. This one is Ligeti.
Oh, Ligeti.
Ligeti,
okay. The acoustic
Hungarian.
in here is a huge acoustic.
Yes, I know, yeah. Well, anyway, so a lot of violin concertos have been written, which is very exciting. And it's like a renaissance of violin concerto writing. And the Adès concerto struck me immediately when I heard it as a very special piece. One way that when I listen to a new piece, one thing I pay attention to is, after I have only heard it once, what do I remember, and is there something that I absolutely want to hear again? And there was this piece. I couldn't get it out of my mind. I had to hear it many times, and I got the music, and I started learning it. And then later, I did a recording myself of it and played it for Thomas Ades, got his advice and his input. And now, more recently, I've been playing with him as a conductor. And soon, in a few months, we'll be playing together the Ligeti Concerto, which was a big inspiration for him when he wrote his violin concerto. And he wrote a new cadenza for the Ligeti Concerto. So the Ligeti Concerto now has a new cadenza by Thomas Ades, which I'll play the premiere of. And around this time, actually, now in the last few days, I was practicing that. And like everything that Ades or Ligeti write, it seems actually unplayable at first, the first time you look at the music. And then you start trying to see, well, how can this be done? But it's very good music.
First time I listened to you play it, I just listened to it as new music because I was completely unfamiliar with it. And I went, okay, the first movement is very bright, very bright. Second movement is more dark. And then the third movement is hopeful. I went, yeah, oh, I like it. Now I want to hear it again and see what else I learned. That's my first go through with it, and I enjoyed your performance of that. He, at the end of this month, is going to premiere with the Met his opera, The Exterminating Angel. Are you going to go be in New York for it?
I'll definitely try to be there at one of the performances, because I've heard his previous opera, The Tempest, and I thought it was brilliant.
Brilliant.
I love his string quartets, and he's just I love so much of his music. And the violin concerto, every time I've performed it, requires a lot of rehearsals. It's a very, very complex piece and so much going on. But every time I'm through a string of performances, I actually can't get it out of my head. It's even a week later, it's still going around there. It's one of those pieces, and I think it's a sign of a really great work.
Well, his opera is an old story from 1920 in the 1920s, and there's an instrument in it that's featured, and it's a mesmerizing instrument, so mesmerizing that the audience doesn't ever leave, at least in the opera.
Right.
Have you ever heard of it before? It's Ontes Martenot.
The Ons Martenot.
I've never heard it until I searched it up on YouTube.
Messiaen uses it in some of his music.
Messiaen does.
Ons Martenot, for example, in the Turanga Lila Symphony by Messiaen, it's used. That's a work written in the late 40s, I think, and was one of my favorite pieces to listen to for a long time.
Well, HD Met audiences should know that November the 18th is the day that it can be seen in theaters throughout the world, which has really changed opera. Isn't that great what the Met is doing? There's over 300,000 people watching it every HD performance. How many performances would need to be in the Met Opera House to get 300,000? How many seasons is that?
Yeah.
It's just
true.
Great. My hat's off to Peter Gelb. He's done. It's a rough business anyway, but he's done so many transformative ideas. Tell me about how life-changing it was for you to win Indianapolis Violin Concerto competition.
This was at this point 11 years ago, so in 2006, that I went to the Indianapolis violin competition. And at the time, I was still a student at Juilliard. I had I was busy. I had a lot of things to do, and I had performances. But I was doing a bunch of competitions, trying to somehow kickstart things, get more known. And this really changed everything, because a lot of people were following online, were watching it live. This was actually the first violin competition where you could really watch the entire thing video streamed, which now is that's a very normal thing for competitions to do. But at the time, it was rather new technology, and was actually wasn't easy it wasn't as easy to do from a technical point of view yet back in 2006. And a lot of people saw me play for the first time, and in that way it opened a lot of doors.
What did you perform?
Oh, there was everything. It's one of the big.
It's like Van Cliburn, only for violin.
Basically, I think very similar. The biggest violin competitions ask for a very varied repertoire. So first round was 2 Paganini caprices, 2 movements of Bach, and a slow, I don't know how you would want to call it, slow showpiece or a slow sentimental piece.
Adagio.
You had a whole selection of things to choose from, different pieces by Kreisler, or I did a Chopin nocturnes transcribed, or just something they wanted something more emotional for contrast, I think. In the second round, we played a major sonata and
what did you choose?
The Tuasik showpiece.
Or did they choose it for you? What did you?
No. Actually, it was very nice that there was a lot of choices you had, so you could actually program in very different ways, in very different directions. And I thought a very long time, especially because of other competitions I'd done and the experiences I'd had. I had made the experience that if you program the wrong thing, specifically works where your interpretation might be a little bit more unusual, then you're kind of asking for trouble. And I had played a Brahms sonata at a competition, and I was eliminated, and I asked the jurors later what they thought, and one person said it was too fast, and the other person said it was too slow. And then I said, I shouldn't have programmed this Brahms. People have very strong and very different opinions on how it should go, and there is actually a lot of music where the opinions differ much less. People will agree much more. Well, this is pretty much how it should be played. So I actually did my best to choose music like that. This is, and in any case, less of an issue in the first round, I think, than in the second round. So I chose for the big sonata the Bartók solo sonata, which also is a big, extremely difficult, very serious work, and a piece that I loved very much, that I played very much, and so I felt very, very secure in this. And then for my main concerto in the last round, I chose the second Bartók concerto, and basically avoided romantic pieces like Tchaikovsky and Brahms, where someone in the jury, and they're all violinists themselves who've played this piece and have their own very specific interpretation, which may be very different from mine, and to kind of avoid a situation where they might just get extremely angry and say, that's not how it goes. You know, you can get these reactions.
Sure. But not everybody's playing Bartók 2.
And Bartók 2, first of all, it is played a little bit less, and also it is a work where the composer writes in everything. Bartók writes in so many things, and actually anyone following along on the score will say, well, you know, he's doing what the composer wrote. Whereas somebody like Brahms, he actually is very careful to not write too much. He leaves a lot up to the performer. He gives very few instructions, which are incredibly significant, the few things that he writes in. But there are maybe more choices are up to the performer. And
so how did that change your that was really your entree to U.S. performance, was your victory there? Was that a great stepping stone to a successful U.S. career?
Yes, I think so, very much so. I had played with some orchestras before in the years leading up to it, and I had a management already, and I mean, some things were happening, but it is in general, when you start your career, extremely hard to just be given a debut somewhere, because there's so many people knocking at the door of these orchestras. Everyone wants to play concertos, and so just this competition got the name out there. People were watching, and it opened a lot of doors. One thing that I'm very happy about, actually, now in hindsight, is that things didn't happen too fast for me. So at the time, actually, I was incredibly impatient. I wanted to play everywhere immediately, and I didn't really get this. But I think now that I look back, I think that I'm very happy that it was only a few years later, so 2-3 years later, that I played the first time with a major orchestra in the U.S. So about 2 years later, I played with the Los Angeles Philharmonic because it was a cancellation. And then with Cleveland Orchestra, and then New York Philharmonic had a cancellation the year after that. And that it didn't happen kind of when I wasn't ready for it. So in the first couple of years after the competition, I had a lot of concerts with slightly smaller orchestras with a slightly lower pressure.
Sure.
But the great thing about the musical life in this country is that there are so many, especially right now, nowadays, there's so many orchestras that play really well. They play at a very high level where you can give a really nice performance of all these pieces. And I got the chance to gain a lot of experience on each one of those concertos, which I may have performed some of them before. I mean, many of them I had performed at some point, but to really get a lot of performances of something like, I don't know, Tchaikovsky under my belt before I step in front of a really major, scary orchestra in a big city, and because that is a totally different.
It's a big spotlight under Dudamel in
pressure,
LA,
yeah,
isn't it? A big spotlight under Dudamel and playing with him, I would imagine.
Yes, I have not worked with him.
You haven't worked with him.
This was
Did
a
you
guest
play
conductor.
in the Disney Hall?
Yes, I have, and that was also a cancellation. The first time, though, that was at the Hollywood Bowl. And in fact,
cool.
The conductor was also a replacement. Both the conductor and the soloists had canceled, I believe, and so that's yeah. It's somehow you get the call. Can you play? That was actually Prokofiev's second concerto. Can you play Prokofiev's second concerto in 2 days or 3 days? And I thought, can I? Okay, and I went. And these are decisions you have to make quite quickly.
A guy named Lenny Bernstein started a career that very much like that.
Yeah, it was. Sometimes the biggest chances appear like this, and you have to know when to say no, because if you actually feel like this is too much, and there were a few cases when I said, no, I don't feel ready with this piece, because it would be fine if it was in 2 weeks, but not tomorrow. You have to kind of know yourself enough to know when and to know what you can take on, because it's always better not to go than to go and it doesn't go well. But if you can do it, the wonderful thing is everybody is so happy that you're there. Everyone's so grateful that you did it, that you're kind of saving the program. You agreed to play this piece and you arrived and in the nick of time, and so actually already there's a really positive feeling in the air about me when
the orchestra
has
rehearsed Prokofiev, and you're going to come in and you're going to play Prokofiev too. That's what you stood in for, Prokofiev. Is that right?
That was Prokofiev's second, yes.
Second. Mm-hmm.
And of course, well, the Hollywood Bowl, this is on one rehearsal, so you just you run it through once and then the concert. It's very exciting.
What did you think of playing here with the San Antonio Symphony and this brand new hall? We're under 5 years old here. How did you like the sound?
It's an excellent hall.
Can the artist hear? Can you hear yourself well on stage there?
Yes. Well, I mean, my ear is right next to the violin, so I can always.
Okay.
It's extremely loud under my ear, but I can hear. I think I can hear the orchestra very clearly. I think, and there's a good feeling about the communication that we have, how we can hear each other, and also the sound color that the sound has is nice and warm and beautiful. And there's many halls where the hall somehow does not help. It's not helpful, you know. In this case, it creates a nice warmth.
And Sebastian's tempi, he can light the hall up with his tempos.
He really went for it, yes.
Yes, which he did with Tchaikovsky. Yeah. Well, you mentioned that as far as you were concerned, from what you had found out, you said that Tchaikovsky's favorite composer was Mozart. Where did you read about that?
Well, there was a quote, I think it was in a letter that Tchaikovsky wrote, where he talked about Beethoven and Mozart, and he kind of called Mozart Mozart was the god for him.
Well, he's a god for everybody.
But
his first movement of the Tchaikovsky is very Mozart. It's very classical, isn't it?
I think so. This the first theme, which is not the start of the piece, of course, but when I play the first theme, it's very elegant and has this kind of rococo elegance, like the rococo variations. It goes it's very very elegant, and many parts of the first movement are very much ballet music. I think there's a lot of jumps in the music that you can hear, and you can just see people.
Everything Tchaikovsky wrote was a ballet.
Jump. Everything was a ballet, even when it's a violin concerto, it's totally ballet music. And this lightness is, I think, very important, particularly in the material of the first theme. And when you get to the second theme, that's the one that's really very romantic and very deeply felt and very passionate. But I think this contrast between the two themes is important. If you already play the first theme only as a lyrical, really passionate romantic theme, then you don't have this contrast. And you have the second theme, and it only feels like more of the same when it actually is meant. I mean, always in sonata form, traditionally, the second theme is contrasting, and it's quite different. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you grew up in Italy, but you're German. You grew up on a farm, is that correct? Did I remember hearing, reading, whatever, that your attachment to the violin was via YouTube?
No.
No?
That's not true at all.
Someone else that I was... But I mean, your instruction was from whom? Where did your early instruction come from?
Because YouTube came about in 2004, 2000 something around then. I don't know about the year.
You're only 30.
I'm 33. So
32.
when I learned the violin, I started learning the violin when I was back in 1989 or so that I got the violin. So it was actually extremely difficult at the time. Perhaps that was the point I was making that you read about.
Okay.
It was extremely difficult when I was little to watch a great violinist play. You really had to go into a big city to go to their concert, but you couldn't really see it, or you had to play for them in a lesson, or you could get maybe a videotape. But it was really rather difficult to get this kind of influence. You only had recordings. So I spent a lot of time listening to these great violinists, especially Oistrakh, play, and then trying to sound like him, but I didn't know how did he do the things, because I couldn't see it. And I think this is something that's very different now for the young generations of musicians, that they can just go on YouTube and watch all the great violinists of the past and present perform and see exactly what they're doing in close-up. You can look at their fingerings and bowings and pretty much see how they do it. And I think that has been a big change for people who are not born into musical families, or who are not who don't grow up in big cities surrounded by musicians, but who are from more rural areas like I was. So in my case, my first teacher was my father, who was an amateur musician. He played the cello and the piano, but his mother had been a violin teacher. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought because of that.
Was your mother also a musician?
No, she's not. So he was my first teacher, and then he took me to other teachers.
And then you studied in Germany?
I studied a little bit all over the place with different people and assortment of
Lots of
many
Germans
different
came to Italy
teachers.
too. I mean, Wagner died in Venice. Mozart changed his style. He learned so much when he came to Italy, and I'm sure there were others. I mean, German speaking, Austrian as well, of course. But
Yes, well, I think my parents were not the first Germans to have to realize what a beautiful place Italy is and to move there, and it was a beautiful place to grow up. And it is true that when I was growing up, quite a lot of people would vacation in Italy or had places there, and this is how I was studying with Christoph Poppen and also later Norbert Breinin from the Amadeus Quartet, who had a place in Florence and was living part-time there. So, you know, we just knocked on his door and he started teaching me lessons. So this is actually, this is something that even though it's not a big urban center, everybody does eventually go there and turn up there. A lot of these artists.
Florence is not a bad destination for anything at all.
true.
What a wonderful place. We are so delighted that you could come and join us here in San Antonio, bring your musicality, which is deep and wonderful and passionate, and look forward to your performances here Friday and Saturday night. Thank you for your time, and we hope you come back soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Augustine.
All right, thanks.